So here's the spreadsheet that will help us understand the computation of the capital adequacy ratio. In the very first worksheet, I presented only the balance sheet of the Bank of Utopia. So what we have here in this session, we will look at how solvency is managed using a very ubiquitous matrix called the capital adequacy ratio. Capital adequacy ratio, or CAR for short. In this session, we will look at how solvency is managed using a very ubiquitous matrix called the capital adequacy ratio. Capital adequacy ratio, or CAR for short, also called capital to risk assets ratio, CRAR for short, measures a bank's capital as a percentage of its risk weighted assets. Now there are two operating phrases here, capital and risk weighted assets. Capital is classified as tier 1 capital and tier 2 capital, and we will look at that classification a little later. Risk weighted assets involves computing the assets on the bank's balance sheet based on the degree of risk associated with each class of assets. Example, investments in treasury bonds or government securities carry risk weight of 0%, whereas unsecured loans to companies would carry a risk weight of 100%. And there are several other asset classes which would lie between the 0% and 100%. We will look at how to compute risk weighted assets a little later in this session. So capital adequacy ratio is tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital divided by the risk weighted assets. This capital adequacy ratio has been implemented globally starting the mid-1990s based on the guidelines issued by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, which was set up by the Bank of International Settlements, hence commonly referred to as Basel I capital. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has recommended a minimum capital adequacy ratio of 8%. However, that could be greater than 8% and vary from country to country depending on the directives issued by the central bank of each country. But it cannot, under any circumstance, be below 8%. To understand the composition of capital adequacy ratio, we will look at 1. The composition of capital, 2. Computing tier 1 capital and tier 2 capital, 3. the composition of assets that should be included in the capital adequacy calculation, and 4, computing the risk-weighted assets based on the directives issued by the central bank of the country. Composition of capital. Basel I defines 2 tiers of capital, Tier 1 capital and Tier 2 capital. Tier 1 capital is the core capital comprising of paid up equity capital, statutory reserves, capital reserves, less the carry forward losses, if any, reflected in the balance sheet of the bank. Tier 2 capital comprises all other forms of reserves, undisclosed reserves, revaluation reserves, loan loss reserves, investment fluctuation reserves. The details of some of these reserves we will look at in later sessions in this course. In addition, Tier 2 capital comprises subordinated debt, which are long-term bonds issued by the bank, minus investments in the equity capital of subsidiaries. 2 caveats in the context of Tier 2 capital should be borne in mind. Number 1, total Tier 2 capital cannot be greater than 100% of Tier 1 capital. And 2, subordinated debt cannot exceed 50% of the Tier 1 capital. Again, these caveats could vary from country to country. While issuing guidelines, the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision has permitted the banking regulators in each country to have marginal variations in the interpretation and classification of Tier 1 and Tier 2 capital based on the context prevailing in each country. However, at a minimum, the guidelines issued by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision have necessarily to be complied with and cannot be compromised or diluted. A host of instruments such as perpetual debt, perpetual cumulative preference shares, etc., issued by banks from time to time are also eligible to be included either under Tier 1 capital or under Tier 2 capital, again as per the directives of the central bank of the country. Broadly speaking, perpetual instruments, that means instruments with no maturity date, such as perpetual preference capital or capital raised through perpetual debt, can be included in Tier 1 capital. Other securities such as bonds that are issued with a specific maturity date and are long term in nature can be included in Tier 2 capital. Now let's look at risk weighted assets. First of all, risk assets comprise loans, investments, etc. that carry a credit risk. That means a potential loss arising from the risk of the borrowers or the issuers of the bond not meeting their repayment obligations on the loan or the bond. Risk assets are therefore converted into risk-weighted assets based on the risk weight assigned to every class of asset. For example, treasury bonds and government securities carry zero credit risk. In other words, there is no risk of default. Hence, the risk weight is 0. On the other hand, corporate bonds that are essentially unsecured loans could carry 100% risk weight. The risk weight on mortgage loans or home loans, as it is called in some countries, are relatively low, given that such loans are always secured by the real estate that it has financed, and hence the risk weight could be, say, 50%. With that understanding of Tier 1 capital, Tier 2 capital and risk-weighted assets, in the next session we will look through a spreadsheet to compute the capital adequacy ratio of a fictitious bank called the Bank of Utopia.